for my mom. Um, so we want to begin by offering actually a 1 minute of silence in thinking about the violence towards the Asian women in Atlanta. So let's begin with that before we start our event. So 1 minute of silence, please, for them. Thank you, everybody. So we'll begin. My name is Omar Ali. I'm one of the organizers of these Ashby Dialogues. I'm a faculty member here at UNC Greensboro. And I'd like to welcome you to the second conversation in the Ashby Dialogue series on Indian Ocean currents at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. The Ashby Dialogues are founded on the late Warren Ashby's vision of community inquiry, a collaborative knowledge production between students and faculty in and beyond the classroom. This series is part of the work that Nilofer Kadir, Hewan Girma, and myself are undertaking as part of the broader interests of the Ethiopia and East African Studies Research Network, which was founded in August of 2019. Our aim in cultivating this multi, and transdisciplinary series is to explore the cultures, histories, and significance of Indian Ocean worlds with an emphasis on their relations to the global African diaspora. We have invited colleagues at different stages of their careers to build relationships between tenured senior colleagues and early career scholars. And we have focused on those scholars who are located locally to us in central North Carolina, here in the Piedmont, because we believe that thinking from our South, especially from the ground of a minority serving institution such as ours, offers an important contribution to the discourses on Indian Ocean worlds and South-South relationships. We would like to thank the Ashby Dialogue Committee for funding this series, as well as the departments and programs of African American and African Diaspora Studies, International and Global Studies, and English. We also thank Lloyd International Honors College. For ensuring a smooth webinar experience, we thank Amanda Shipman in IT and providing logistics support during and after the event. We want to thank many people who are helping to produce this. A few remarks about the event. Our format is of 4 moderated questions followed by an open conversation with attendees. Please use the chat to share who you are, your interests, and where you are joining from, if you'd like. Direct all comments and questions for the conversation period to us via the Q&A box, and let us know if you'd be willing to share on mic. If you are, we will invite you to unmute your mic when we get to your question or comment. You are also welcome to enable live transcription for the event. The recording of this event will be made available with a short delay to all registered participants. I'll now turn things over to my colleague, Nilofer Kadir, who is, and I'm going to introduce her formally. Nilofer is Assistant Professor of English and International and Global Studies. Currently, she is working on her first book, tentatively titled Afrasian Imaginaries, Global Capitalism in Indian Ocean Worlds. In addition to her scholarship, she co-translated with her parents Ngugi wa Thiong'o's short story, The Upright Revolution in Urdu for Jalada, Africa in 2017. Her teaching and research interests include post-colonial literature and theory, Indian Ocean studies, and histories of global capitalism. Dr. Kadir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali. I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues, Dr. Hewan Girma and Dr. Lina Benabdallah today. And so without further ado, I'll just begin to introduce them and then we'll move into the questions. Lina Benabdallah is Assistant Professor of Politics and International Studies at Wake Forest University. Her first book, Shaping the Future of Power, Knowledge Production and Network Building in China-Africa Relations, was published last year by the University of Michigan Press. Benabdallah has published widely in peer-reviewed journals such as International Studies Quarterly and the African Studies Quarterly, as well as news media such as the Washington Post, Al Jazeera, and Foreign Policy. Hewan Girma is Assistant Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. She's currently working on her first book on Ethiopian return migration. Her research and teaching interests include transnational migration, race and ethnicity, intersectional identities, and African diasporic populations. Thank you, Drs. Girma and Benabdallah, for joining us today. Let me begin by inviting you to describe some of your current and recent scholarship and teaching projects and how you understand that work to be engaging in Indian Ocean studies broadly conceived. And Dr. Benabdallah, why don't we begin with you?
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, Dr. Kadir, Dr. Ali, and Girma. I am very happy to join the series. And it's a delight to be on the panel with you today to discuss this. So in terms of my research, I have recently started a project that really looks at basically looks at how how narratives of the past are used in foreign policy making. I should start by saying I'm a scholar of international relations, and so the perspective I bring to this is a perspective of international politics / international relations theory. In this current project I'm working on, I have examined how the current or new Silk Road, the new maritime Silk Road, is talked about, how it's branded, how it is basically mentioned or linked to the ancient Silk Road in Chinese elites' foreign policy or official discourse. And in so doing, of course, when I talk about the maritime Silk Road, what I find about the way that the maritime Silk Road is talked about today, the Belt and Road Initiative, the maritime Silk Road, I find that there are linkages that are done and made to the past. And these linkages oftentimes in my own research are linkages that are basically that look at the Indian Ocean as a structure of feelings. It's a structure of feelings, it's a structure of nostalgic feelings, a structure of affect, right? An archive of sensibilities and an archive of affect that is tapped into as Chinese elites and government officials are talk about the new Silk Road. So bringing back memories from the past, bringing back narratives of the past in order to speak about what the Indian Ocean, what the maritime Silk Road can bring about in the future is sort of what's interesting to me. In this recent article I published just a few months ago, I look at the legacy of maritime explorer Enseng Ho, sometimes also known in the pronunciation of Enseng Ho. And in these maritime expeditions, Enseng Ho in the 15th century during the Ming Dynasty, in one of these expeditions, Enseng Ho arrives to the eastern coast of Africa. So those encounters and the way that Enseng Ho's expeditions have made that basically, in a way, the modern China-Africa relations, and how are those encounters? How do they figure, and how are they brought up in current discourses of Chinese foreign policy makers about the China-Africa relations? And so, briefly, Zheng He becomes a huge legend. It becomes a very popular name when we listen and read discourses and speeches about China-Africa relations today. And I examine why such a figure becomes so prominent today. This is 15th century navigator who is talked about and brought up in these relations. And a lot of it is in this way, framing the China-Africa relations, the China or Afro-Asia in this bigger context relations through these maritime expeditions as expeditions that were done in a peaceful way. They were about cultural exchanges, and they were about trade and commerce. They were not about sort of the European encounters with the African continent that were mostly viewed or just conducted through the prisms of violence and colonialism and imperialism and sort of legacies of slavery, etc. And so it's really interesting to me to understand, tapping into that nostalgic narrative of the past, of bringing back Zheng He and framing this whole maritime Silk Road as an initiative that it just basically brings back those memories and the narratives of cultural exchanges and peaceful interactions between Chinese and Africans, or between Asians and Africans. And so in this way, the study of the Indian Ocean in this project is really thinking about it from the perspective of not as a geographical location or a set of places, but as a structure of feeling, an archive of feelings, emotions, and affect, of nostalgic triggers that to me help me understand how what kind of narratives of the past are brought up into the current political discourse between Chinese elite and their African counterparts. How is that deployed in order to shape a narrative of the future interactions between Chinese and African intellectuals and peoples in general?
Thanks so much. Dr. Girma.
Thank you. So my research focuses on African migration generally conceived, like it's a very broad area. And I've looked at return migration more specifically. And return migration is just a simple, people leave and then people come back. And for some reason, especially when talking about the African continent, a lot of scholars, they're like, really return migration happens? And that was that was my dissertation project. And that was the reaction that I got, which really made me continue through this pattern in a way to kind of challenge some of those perceptions. In return migration, I mean, there's plenty of examples in the African continent, right? Like if you're looking at West Africa, return of Afro-Brazilians, return of like the creation of Liberia and Sierra Leone. If you look at Ethiopia, which is my focus, you have the movement of Rastafarians. So you have a lot of all these historical and more contemporary movements. But I'm looking at voluntary return, more specifically, people who were not deported, people who were not forced in any way to leave the destination country, but have chosen to resettle voluntarily. And there's a specific reason why I do that, because of course the experiences are going to be very different based on if it was voluntary or forced. I've looked at mostly return from quote unquote the West, right? Like Western Europe and North America broadly conceived, but there's a lot of return movements that happens from other parts of the world as well. Like one of the massive migration that is taking place currently from Ethiopia is towards the Middle East. And I hate that term, but whenever I say Southwest Asia, I usually get this confused look from students. But there's like the problem of Orientalism, of course, when we're talking about Middle East or the term Middle East. So when we're talking about migration to the Middle East, we're talking about a very gendered form of migration. It's mostly young women. So gender and age combination is significant. And when they go there, there's families that are very dependent on their remittances, but there's a big outcry from the home country saying, like, we are losing our daughters, something is happening, something must be done. The same type of outcry does not exist when we're talking about migration towards the West, right? It's kind of seen mostly as a positive thing. Right, so there is this sort of hierarchy of destinations where you're going to the West versus the East. So I'm very interested in this dynamic between comparing this cosmologist of destination. This is a term I'm borrowing from another scholar from Bologna. So looking at how this migration towards the East is conceived as something bad. And something new as well. Like, I think there is a tendency to think that everything is new somehow when we think about globalization, right? We're kind of like, oh, this new thing is happening. Well, no, it has happened in the past before. We just don't see the historical continuities. So I'm interested in uncovering some of the movements of young Ethiopian women, not just in contemporary times, but even historically, and kind of outlining the similarities in between these two movements. So that's one of the major areas in terms of my intervention and how it relates to the Indian Ocean world. I have to admit, though, I'm originally from Ethiopia, but unfortunately the Indian Ocean studies was not really in my radar until very recently. Somehow there is a domination of migration towards elsewhere and not towards the East. And somehow, like, the Indian Ocean world was not something that was discussed prominently, and that's one of the things that I'm seeking to correct at the moment, kind of thinking about not just migration towards quote unquote the Middle East, but also thinking about contemporary migrations of Ethiopians specifically, but more generally Africans towards places like China and India, which are like the two major destinations for Africans at the moment. And I think this relates to some of your work, Dr. Lina. So kind of thinking about how these contemporary migration movements, one, relate to the historical movements that we've had in the past. So how they're continuations as opposed to new phenomenons, which is, how they're presented, how they may be presented in terms of the media and even scholarly work. And thinking about why certain migrations generate a sort of a panic versus others that do not. Right. And of course, you can imagine some of this panic around migration has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, right? A couple of nations, such as Lebanon, has quote unquote expelled significant amount of women migrants that were working as domestic servants, as caretakers. But because of the pandemic, their solution was just, you need to go. And there's a problem on the reception side because we're talking about thousands, if not millions, of people that are being reabsorbed into the society. And there's a stigma associated with that because they're deported at this point, right? They're not voluntary returnees. So thinking about perceptions and reabsorption and thinking about movements within these areas more generally.
Thank you both so much. You've started us off in such a fascinating way, and like already questions are brewing for me, and if they are for audience members too, like you don't have to wait until the end, you can start sending us your questions. So for my next question, I think both of you have begun to talk about this a little bit already, but if I might draw you out a little bit more to say, how did you come to be involved in the particular fields that you are involved in? And how do you see them shaping the work that you're doing? So I'm really thinking of an intellectual biography of sorts.
Okay, so I have began working on China-Africa relations as a doctoral student. I've done split fieldwork experiences between Kenya and Ethiopia and China. This was around 2015, 2016. At the time of writing my dissertation, I was interested in questions of people-to-people connections, the place of people-to-people ties, and thinking about just how to conceptualize China-Africa relations from that perspective in order to expand on, or in a way, really in order to decenter international relations theories, which have typically only examined sort of the perspectives of power as insofar as they relate to material aspects, meaning thinking about size of militaries, or thinking about sort of boots on the ground kind of engagements, or thinking about sort of ways of counting or measuring the size of China's power in X or Y region. In my own interest, I wanted to think about the China-Africa relations from the perspective of a relational approach, from the perspective of net building, from the perspective of building sort of a connective tissue that I saw was extremely important in the exchanges that I've observed during my fieldwork. Meaning, when I was in China, both when I was in Ethiopia and in Kenya, I saw that there was a lot of movements and a lot of importance given to organizing seminars and trips and trainings and exchange programs and all kinds of knowledge production fora that were bringing together Chinese and African counterparts. And I was interested in that. How do we capture this? How do we understand this? Where does this figure in the thinking about sort of international politics and power politics from an international relations perspective? And so I came to this interest from the perspective of from the experiences I had writing my dissertation and working on what became my first book. And I've basically done a lot of my research is built on participants, sometimes observations, meaning to me, moments when I'm sitting around and listening to Africans talk about their experiences in China without me interviewing them or without me formally being involved in the process, were extremely important. And those were, you can call them sort of random observations, but they were really extremely eye-opening experiences that I had just by traveling and being in the audience of young Africans as they were discussing their experiences, etc. Those were very formative and informative at the same time. And of course, I relied on formal interviews as well, and discourse analysis, and looking at what official documents were available, and so on. So these were basically the tools that I had used in shaping the book project and the dissertation work that I've done. As I said earlier, sort of moving a bit towards my current project, it's again, still within looking at maybe expanding on the China-Africa experience to go in a little bit, both a little bit broader in scope and back in time, meaning looking at, I'm interested these days reading about early encounters, the early encounters that, we talk about Afro-Asian solidarity, we talk about, the Bandung Conference and China's role in African revolutionary past, and my interest is really going back and rebuilding that narrative and looking at all the nuance and the differences and all of that, sort of the building block into that today make up this connective tissue that I'm talking about. So in a way, going back to the early building blocks of this piece. And in so doing, of course, like I said earlier, we cannot be talking about China-Africa relations today without somehow thinking about the Belt and Road Initiative or encountering it somewhere, somehow. But of course, the Belt and Road Initiative or the New Silk Road is extremely connected to and anchored in narratives of the ancient Silk Road. And so it's really interesting to me to go back and sort of build those connections between past, present, those bridges between, the way China-Africa relations were framed in the past and now. And so that's sort of where I'm at in terms of connecting sort of my dissertation work to my current research interests.
So I have to say I'm a relative newcomer to this field, right? My undergraduate and graduate training did not expose me to Indian Ocean World Studies at all. And I'm really happy to be able to do that for my students, right? Because especially teaching in an American university, most of them have not heard about this side of the world, and this is relatively new to them. So in my Making of the African Diaspora class, I introduced them to African descendants in India and Pakistan, and students are like, oh, we thought African descendants, the African diaspora was only in the West or like in the Americas. And so kind of having those conversations has been really good, and kind of broadens my students' perspectives in a way. So for me, I had to actually come to UNCG before I started looking at this region more specifically. And together with my colleagues, Nilofer and Omar, we founded the Ethiopian and East African Studies Research Network. And as part of this, where this Ashby Dialogue is sponsored by that, among other things, we were able to kind of delve into this area a little bit more. So as I've said, I'm originally from Ethiopia, but when I was there, and even like all the research trips that I've taken since moving away from that, from my home country, has not involved much discussion within this region. And I think that's something that we really need to correct in academia, that we shouldn't have such a narrow focus globally, and that we need to expose our students to things that they're usually not exposed to. So once I discovered this region, I'm a sociologist by training, but I started looking at the historical connections between different regions, between different movements of people, and sort of comparison between what happened to the African diaspora in the Indian Ocean world versus what happened in the Black Atlantic, I think is one very fruitful exercise, both for me and in my classrooms. I hope to be able to expand this by looking more at, again, contemporary movements of Ethiopians or East Africans towards places like India and China, because again, these are the new destinations, but somehow there's just not enough research on it. So again, this is the beginning of the journey for me, and hopefully we'll continue having these conversations and it will grow.
Thank you both. I'm really struck in your remarks about your turn toward historical legacies and connections. And I think historians have probably longer than some of the rest of us in disciplines been working on Indian Ocean as a field. And so with that kind of in mind, especially as both of you, we've described your work as the political economy of Indian Ocean world. And it may be that there are some tensions there, and you may not necessarily describe your work that way. So I'll leave that on the table for you to answer. But I also want to invite you to think about what an oceanic framework in particular might contribute to your work. And particularly since both of you have worked in Ethiopia a little bit, like how might questions of the oceanic or oceanic interpretations bring to Ethiopia, a country that doesn't have a coastline?
Shall I take this one first, or do you want to go first, Dr. Girma?
Oh, please go ahead.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to be extremely candid here, and hopefully there will be colleagues in the audience that will disagree, and this will be a good conversation. But I would say the Indian Ocean, for better or worse, occupies a significant place in the field of international relations. As I mentioned earlier, I come to this from this particular disciplinary corner. And I say for better or worse because obviously, different works focus on different things, etc. But really, as a scholar who, as I see myself, really more of a critical international relations theory thinker and a critical thinker in general. I mean, I will say that sometimes, if a topic makes it to the top, interests in international relations, it's not always a good sign. It typically means, it means it's a topic that, now is attracting a certain framework of study in political or international politics, typically characterized by sort of an urgency or something that's alarmist or something that's a security threat. Those, discourses that we are all too familiar with about power competition and sort of power politics, that frameworks that tend to do a couple of things. I think tend to basically override the nuances that exist, in that sort of Indian Ocean as sort of this capacious, huge field of study, and it just overrides the nuance in favor of generalizations. I mean, this is a lot of what typical or mainstream international theory or international relations theory do. Not all of them, hopefully some colleagues will disagree, but sweeping generalizations that lean themselves to grand theorizing. I mean, this is a lot of what international relations does. And I think that does a bit of, the second thing that's related to this is that the histories of each and every different place and peoples and areas and get reduced. Rather, there's an element of reducing that to some basically parsimonious theory that can explain the whole Indian Ocean in one way. And I think that that's sometimes when the Indian Ocean crosses or intersects international relations, it's typically around competition between the US and some other power or some security threat that's viewed as some kind of zero-sum game somewhere. And so, when this comes to my work, I actually actively disengage from using the terminology of the Indian Ocean because it signals something that I was just talking about earlier. That it signals in a way that that the work, it could be open to those above interpretations that I mentioned earlier. And so, yeah, you probably will not find the terminology of Indian Ocean or oceanic studies in my research, even though it is about these interactions and very much about Afro-Asian, in a way. Sort of Dr. Kadir mentioned it, sort of in the Afro-Asian sort of imaginaries. But there is a cost to doing that in certain, disciplines, and in my own field, it can be interpreted as sort of the latest fad in looking at whatever is going on in terms of power competition. And so that's a bit, that's something that I try to stay away from. Yeah, I'll let probably Dr. Girma speak to the sort of what the apparent or seeming paradox or contradiction in oceanic studies when it comes to Ethiopia. I mean, obviously, I mentioned earlier in the piece that I wrote and in the work that I'm doing on Admiral Zheng He and those expeditions, and the way that the narratives of Zheng He make it to explaining the past and at the present and the future of China-Africa relations. Kenya is salient, and as well as so Kenya becomes a huge case, and like I said, I've done fieldwork there earlier, and I also will mention that, for example, in all over the world, you see monuments and temples and statues dedicated to the memory of Zheng He, and one of these places is Mombasa. So there is now a train terminal station in Mombasa that celebrates the legacy of Zheng He in the connection of sort of China-Kenya friendship. And of course, there are a lot of other mentions and references to Zheng He in relation to Kenya-China relations. But I just wanted to mention this, that maybe when we're looking at, in my own perspective, I think maybe Kenya, other salient places, maybe you go sort of down the coast. But I'll let Dr. Girma speak to the particular case of Ethiopia.
Thank you for that. So there are a couple of questions in there. First one is in terms of, characterizing my work as political economy, right? I come from a development slash economic background, so I have no problem with using political economy. At the same time, realizing that sometimes these disciplinary backgrounds or like the boundaries are more restrictive than actually allow for broader conversation, right? So usually, most scholars we're trying to overcome some of these very narrow boxes that we're put into and kind of having conversation across the board. As I said, my training has been in economics, but also sociology. Although I'm not trained as a historian, I do a lot of historical social sciences as well. So again, these boundaries are helpful to a certain extent, right? And we can extend the same reasoning to some of the geographic boundaries that we have. So Ethiopia currently does not have a border with the Indian Ocean. But historically, this has not been true, right? It's only in my lifetime that actually Ethiopia lost its ports, its access to the sea, because Ethiopia and Eritrea split and became two countries in 1993. So when I grew up, that was not the case, right? When I remember my childhood, it was kind of like those two were the same country. I won't go into the politics behind that, but we have to be cognizant of the borders of countries shift over time and it changes. What Ethiopia was, let's say 100 years ago, 500 years ago is very different than what it is today. And even with its current geographic and geopolitical borders, it doesn't mean that it's protected or separate from the influences of the ocean, right? Because it's such a huge part of its historical and present day identity. I mean, if we think about commerce, what, 97% of world trade happens through maritime routes, and the bodies of water are very significant to that. And within like UN parlance, we talk about like the disadvantages of landlocked countries. But it's still a huge issue. And let's talk about how nomadic populations don't necessarily recognize the borders that actually exist. So if you're thinking about Somalian Ethiopians and Somalians, right? There really is no border there. So I think that's a very interesting question, but it kind of helps us broaden our thinking in terms of, how narrow are disciplines, how narrow are the current geographies that we have. So what I find particularly useful thinking about this oceanic framework, specifically for my work on return migration and repeat migration, is thinking about the Indian Ocean as a sort of a conveyor belt, right? This is an image that we're all used to that has been repeated because there's so much truth in it, right? This movement, this back and forth between regions, between cultures, between identities, between people, and how the economies of these regions are tied into one another, right? This conveyor belt really has helped me kind of think about, migration is not a one-way journey. It's not even a two-way journey, kind of like the conveyor belt again really helps to kind of think about that. In the last installment of the Ashby Dialogue that we had last month in February, one of our speakers, Kimberly Wortman, was talking about the Ibadi community returning to Oman. So I think, return is not something that happens just for one specific community or one particular place, but it's an ongoing process for a lot of different people. So continuing this movement, this conveyor belt. And of course, when we're talking about movement, we also have to think about what else moves. It's not just the people, right? It's not just the connections between the economies, but cultures and cuisines. That's one of my areas that I'm really fascinated to do research on. Cuisine in general, I think, is fascinating, thinking about how different spices are imported and mixed in, and it's a fun type of research to do as well. So so again, it's a very interesting framework, and it's very broad, and it allows for conversations across different disciplines and geographies.
Thank you both so much. And now I'll turn to the final question for me. We have started to have some questions come in from the audience, and I encourage you to keep going. So by way of ending the formal portion, I'd love to hear from both of you what you think is some of the most exciting work that's being done in your field. And as a second part to that, what advice you might have for early career scholars. And in that I'm including graduate students, people who might be working on post-grad work, as well as undergraduate students who might be interested in pursuing the kind of questions and issues that you both take up in your work.
Yeah, so if I can maybe respond to this question, defining my field more or less as the China-Africa field, because it's just easier to draw those connections. And in so doing, there's just been a lot of excellent work recently. And I will very briefly plug a particular special issue of the African Journal of African Cultural Studies, and I've really enjoyed it. The special issue just came out rather recently, just a few days ago, and a lot of the pieces, it's a special issue on positionality, essentially, in China-Africa relations, and it's a special issue that has several authors from the African continent, from all over the place, writing on their positionality in thinking about China-Africa relations and their own experiences from different perspectives. And so I think there is a deep interest that we see recently in the field of China-Africa relations, in both kind of really going back to understanding in terms of historicizing the relations, but also given voice to scholars and people from the African continent to expand on the perspectives from different places, and what China and how China-Africa relations are perceived from within different aspects of intellectual disciplines and homes in the African continent. And I think that this is definitely great work that's being done. In terms of advice, I'm not sure I'm in a position to sort of give early career scholars a lot of this, because I'm myself an early career scholar, and I would love to hear what other people say to this. But I think really just basically connected to my first part of this answer, really reading multiple books, triangulating with various disciplines. Cross-disciplinary work is really important. Obviously, in Indian Ocean studies, it can only be cross-disciplinary, so that's great. In a way, international relations is that as well, but I think be actively looking for research and looking for what other colleagues and scholars have been doing on the topic from various disciplines is very crucial. I think obviously just reading, I think histories is very important. Obviously times are different now. I would say fieldwork is important, and languages are important, but travel is a little bit questionable right now. I myself have had to put on hold a research trip to Mombasa, essentially, to really look into the manifestations of nostalgia on the ground when it comes to Zhonghe and when it comes to sort of these legacies and these narratives of the past. But for obvious reasons, that's something that I've had to put aside for now. And yeah, so I would say triangulating voices, local voices, other voices and disciplines, various disciplines, is very crucial.
So specifically to my field, there is quite a lot of work on uncovering historical movements of Ethiopians, or more generally East Africans, in different parts of the world. So kind of thinking about this idea of cosmologies of destinations, and questioning, the historical connections between present day contemporary movements vis-a-vis older migrations. So thinking about what it means to migrate present day as a young woman, as a Black migrant within this very complicated world. So there's a lot of work also questioning the status of Ethiopia as an empire, kind of thinking about what has happened, who was forced to migrate, who was able to stay, and the reverse right now, who is quote unquote lucky enough to migrate versus who was forced to stay. So how this perception of migration has changed over time as well. And also thinking about the significance of the East African slave trades for Ethiopia. Again, there's a social panic around a lot of issues in Ethiopia, and one of them is around this issue of slavery, because as a country there is a sort of a denial that this has happened or that it happened at the scale that it has. So relatively newer works are examining this idea of who was the ruler, who was the ruled, who was the enslaved, who were the free folks, and what did that mean in terms of people who had to leave or who were lucky enough to leave, right? Again, this double idea, like, or double-edged sword of migration as both good and bad, depending on the time period that you're thinking of. So there's some relatively new works, mostly in dissertations that have not yet been published. So I'm looking forward to when these works do become more widely available. And I guess this relates to the sort of advice I would give, maybe not necessarily to early career scholars, because I am one, but mostly targeted to students, undergraduate and graduates. I think from a US perspective, especially because if this is where we're located, kind of thinking about the world as not just the Black Atlantic, right? Because I am part of an African diaspora studies program. That is the lens that I'm kind of examining this through. So thinking about the Black diaspora or the African diaspora, something that is much, much larger than anything that we've conceived so far. So as an educator, one of my challenges is always to expose students and to get them interested in areas that they're not necessarily familiar with. So for anybody who's interested in studying this, I think there's plenty of resources, but we still have quite a lot of work to do in terms of making this like an exciting world from a student's perspective.
Thank you both so much. And with that, I will turn things over to questions from our audience. We do have one from James Anderson, and I will ask you to unmute if you would like. And if not, then I can read the question on your behalf. But if you'd like to ask it yourself, please go ahead.
Okay, Nilofer, I'll unmute. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentations. I work on East Asia, specifically China and Southeast Asia, and wondered with the kind of the advance of Islam across the Indian Ocean network in that early period. Certainly, that's when Zheng He is entering into that world of the Indian Ocean world. Does that still resonate today in remembrances of Zheng He's voyages for certain East African communities when they're thinking about him as a figure connecting both sides of the Indian Ocean? Is the fact that he was practicing Muslim and that he went on a Hajj in one of his voyages, is that a significant factor of his remembrance? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. So I think it's something that I would definitely like to find out more about as I conduct some more field work to just see how he's remembered, if he's remembered, and what exactly is remembered for or with. So that's an extremely important question, and it's part of the research, the interest I have in this. I will say though, in terms of what is available to me from reading official documents and speeches, and what's just readily available in terms of discourses by political elites, this particular identity of Zhonghe just doesn't come up that much. It doesn't come up that Zhonghe is a practicing Muslim, and I'm not sure exactly if I have can put forward an explanation as to why I think this is the case. But because Zhonghe has been utilized in this discourse to do two things essentially in the China-Africa current relations, is to put or anchor the new maritime or the new Silk Road in general, the BRI, in the experience of the ancient Silk Road in order to say, sort of remember the exchanges that used to be facilitated by the ancient Silk Road, i.e. the commerce, the trades, the technology, the medicine, the inventions, and all that, connecting that as part of the package that what the BRI can offer in the future. What is the potential for being open to the new Silk Road? What can that do in order to sort of, in this way of bringing back all those legacies of prosperity and so on. The second thing that Zhonghe is the second way that he's brought up is in this narrative to say that this is peaceful, that to say that, you know, that China's China sort of in this contemporary use of the term China-Africa encounters occurred a lot earlier than European encounters with the continent. And they occurred in a way, when we look at sort of the size of the ships and the huge expeditions that were led by Zhonghe, they were sizable and they were huge and they were big. But again, the narrative today is that those were done in a peaceful way, and we all know about the giraffe, the gift that has now been transported across time to symbolize that all that these encounters between Zhonghe and Africans, all they resulted in was that this, you know, giraffe was given as a tribute to the emperor. It wasn't looting, or it wasn't exploiting, or it wasn't, you know, in reference to contrasting China's encounters with Africans with European encounters with Africans, meaning that China's encounters with Africans happened a lot earlier. It had the force and the size that it could have led to much bigger sort of, or impactful in a way, or violent, or whatever else impact. But again, it's saying sort of that this is basically been peaceful. It's basically been about exchanges and cultures. And, you know, we all know about the porcelain that was found, and it still is celebrated in across several museums in Kenya and other parts, and the coins that were found even all the way down in Mozambique. And so the idea is that these encounters have led mostly to, or were conducted in a peaceful way, as opposed to European-African relations, which are primarily colored through sort of violence and exploitation and colonialism and slavery, etc. And so this is the way in which I see Zhonghe being brought up, his particular identity as a practicing Muslim. And it's really interesting because, you know, in the article I have mentioned earlier, I examined a video. It's a promotional video that the Chinese CTGCGTN, so Chinese Global Television Network, has produced a promotional video in July 2020. The promotional video is about, it's kind of like a propaganda sort of a video about the Belt and Road Initiative. It was done just ahead of a summit, a major Belt and Road summit. And so the video is about China-Brunei relations, and China-Brunei being sort of predominantly a Muslim country. The idea is that all these exchanges that were happening between China and Brunei, King Pawnee is celebrated in this video as a devout Muslim, practicing Muslim, who was so basically enamored with essentially now China, he had traveled to give tribute to the emperor, and he was so impressed that he stayed. And when he fell ill, critically ill, he had decided to just stay in China, and sort of he died in China, is buried in China. And so, and the video celebrates essentially the Muslim traditions of burial and so on. And it's kind of interesting. The video is in Chinese, but it also has English subtitles, and it celebrates sort of this idea of China and the Belt and Road Initiative as an inclusive platform. It's an initiative that's open to people from different places, and Brunei, both being sort of, if I may say, sort of in a smaller state, right, and also really predominantly sort of Muslim. It gives this impression, right? So some form of propaganda message that both China and the Belt and Road Initiative are open. But at the same time, you may, one is watching this and asking questions about what's going on in this vis-a-vis treatments of China's own Muslim communities. How is this talked about? How is this processed? What kind of questions are asked? Who's watching this video, and so on? And so it's really interesting. But I just wanted to mention that because even that propaganda video does not shy away from mentioning the particular Muslim identity of King Huani and sort of the encounters between, and Zhong He is mentioned in the video as well, because the time of the story is in sort of 15th century along the ancient Silk Road, and it also makes those connections as well. But that's not really how Zhong He is talked about in the official discourse between China and African countries. Now, hopefully at some point in the future, if I may carry my research, my questions will be about, how does this materialize on the ground? How are people thinking about this? How is this nostalgic narratives and nostalgic repackaging of Zhong He's legacy and histories are remembered on the ground or talked about or not, from the perspective, hopefully, in Mombasa and other parts in Kenya.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
A hand from Jonathan Walls, so I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hello, can you hear me? Good. Thank you very much for the presentations and discussions. I wanted to push back a little bit on the Zhong He kind of framing of the last couple of minutes. I'm an archaeologist and a historian who's worked on the East African coast for about 25 years now. And some interesting things that I've seen develop, I think, as East Africans in the public and the leadership of East African countries become more familiar with the Chinese narrative in antiquity, they've begun to shift the way that they engage it and use it. I think originally they were not particularly informed and kind of viewed it in a superficial way, and knew that they could take advantage of that narrative in the way that it was being presented by the Chinese. But I think more recently, especially in Tanzania, Magufuli, who's a much more independently driven leader, and there's been critiques of that leadership over the past 5 years, has kind of pushed back. Again, they want to maintain, I think, these leaders a positive relationship with China because they know the benefits that can accrue to their countries from such a relationship. But nevertheless, these strong independent streaks and some of the leaders, I think, as they've improved their knowledge about the narrative, has led them to use it in different ways. I think Magufuli, for example, you may know that there was a primary oil terminal that was meant to exit at Lamu in northern Kenya, multi-billion-dollar project that was linked into the Belt and Road Initiative that the Chinese have established. That project, at least in Lamu, was canceled and moved to northern Tanzania. And so now there's a lot of development in the Bagamoyo to Tanga region area related to a new pipeline. And Magufuli actually framed it in one instance, in fact, more than one instance in some newspapers, as a way to follow up on the historic caravan routes that link the deep interior of East Africa to the coast of East Africa. So kind of using the history of East Africa as a way to express independence against the Belt and Road Initiative that was connecting the Indian Ocean, kind of to say, you know, there was an African role in this that was independent, and our agency is as important in this narrative as the agency we've given Zhang He. I also think, you know, from my understanding, doing a lot of reading on that particular narrative, you know, the Chinese essentially at the beginning of the Ming Dynasty were setting up a new system of tribute to the outlying territories. And they were kind of, you know, one of the reasons the Navy was constructed was to kind of get out there and say, you know, we're the big boys back on the block, because they had just undergone the only period in Chinese history where they were essentially ruled by a foreign power, which was the Mongols. So there actually, I think, was a narrative, a more genuine narrative that was tied to the original exploration that you know, was actually one to extract tribute and influence. And there were some violence engagements during that that exploration, especially in Southeast Asia. So I think gradually, as the African leadership has kind of become aware of this narrative, they've started to interpret it in a somewhat new way and push back a bit in some of their decision making and representations. That's my comment. Thank you very much.
Dr. Benabdallah, would you like to add or respond in some way?
No, I think this was a great comment. Thank you so much for making it. And you know, I will just say that I mean, I agree, and of course the question of the project in the Lamu port being cancelled, and that's not the only case, you know, where there's been pushback. I probably just didn't think of it in terms of how it connects to Zhang He and how it connects to this narrative. But I definitely appreciate sort of this way of nudging me to think about it in this perspective. I think it will be also really important, as I said earlier, you know, when you think about the official discourses, it might not necessarily reflect on the ground how the realities and how these discourses and the way that Zhang He has been, you know, framed and talked about, how it doesn't really, it doesn't, you know, the local kind of bottom up reactions don't necessarily transpire or filter through these discourses. And so, you know, I appreciate the perspective, and I look forward to doing a little bit more research on this to see, you know, obviously, like I mentioned earlier, I'm interested in sort of the bust of Zhang He that's just been kind of like put in this terminal. I mean, you know, it'd be interesting, you know, it's one thing to read about how big and important and symbolic of the friendship this is, but at the same time, you know, is it even noticed? Does it make sense? Do people even know what it is? And how do they react to it? Is just going to be extremely important for me to uncover. And so, yeah, I definitely agree on the pushback. It's just that I don't think that I've ever linked the stories of pushback to the narrative about, you know, how the ancient Silk Road and Zhang He's expeditions have been kind of framed in this. And so I appreciate that comment.
Thanks so much. We don't have a question in the queue. So if I might use my position as moderator to ask Dr. Girma to connect a couple of things that are on my mind. So you had talked about migrations that generate panic, and you were thinking in particular about women and girl migrants, contemporary migrants from Ethiopia to Southwest Asia or the Middle East. And I wonder if you would say a little bit more about that and thinking about it, I think a little bit in relation to like who has historically been understood as a mobile subject in relation to like their own desire for mobility. And I'll just say a little bit about why I'm asking. I think it's hard to find historical documents for me that center women's mobility. Women are often across many different contexts, like made domestic subjects. And here, of course, there is a bit of a domestic subjectivity in terms of like domestic labor that's being done in Southwest Asia by women from a number of places, or care work generally. So that's kind of what's inspiring me to ask if there are ways that you can connect these historical and contemporary ideas about who's allowed to be mobile and how with the kind of mobility that's generating panic.
Thank you. I think that's a great question. And as I've said, most of the new work on this is unpublished dissertations, and hopefully, we'll see that kind of circulating a little bit more. In terms of contemporary migration, there's like three big destinations for Ethiopian migrants. The first one is the West, quote unquote, right? So Western Europe, and North America. And that's considered to be a very coveted destination. And in terms of gender, there's no difference in terms of men and women migrating towards this area. The second big destination is South Africa, and kind of thinking about inter-African migration that does not generate as much attention usually as people actually leaving the continent, right? There's a very different perception in terms of what happens. And we're talking both in terms of forced and voluntary migration, right? Although sometimes the boundaries between those two categories is not always clear cut. But specifically in terms of refugee populations, usually it's the neighboring country that receives the majority of those populations. So if you're thinking about Ethiopians, like the number of Ethiopian refugees in the Sudan and Kenya, that's far outnumbers any other migration in other parts of the world. And the third major migration destination is towards Southwest Asia or Middle East more generally. And in terms of this migration, it's a very gendered type of migration where it's young women that are working in care industries, domestic servants, taking care of the elderly, taking care of young children, and even in sex work. Although again, we don't have a clear idea of what the numbers are, especially for sex work, because that's usually underground. So this is the contemporary. And again, thinking about the history of migration from Ethiopia is interesting because even when we're talking about migration during the Haile Selassie regime, right, the emperor that was ousted in 1974, in his time, when people were had the opportunities to leave, for the most part, they refused. And usually these are well-connected individuals when they're asked to serve as ambassadors, as representatives in different countries. There are stories that abound where they go begging the emperor, please do not cast us out of our home, because that's the way it was perceived. Over time, the migration perceptions have changed significantly. Under the communist regime of Mengistu Haile Mariam from 1974 to 1991, a lot of the migration was towards the USSR, right, the former Soviet Union, and also places like Cuba and China, and mostly for education and exchanges around that, communist bloc in a way. So since 1991, migration again has shifted, and the three major destinations that I've talked about are the current big destinations. Now, most of these destinations, we kind of think of them in the scholarly writing as separate from one another. Or if we kind of think of them in tandem, we think of them in terms of creating hierarchies, right? This is a good, this is bad. And of course, you can imagine where that social panic kind of comes from, right? And we live in a global system that really has changed the way we think about race and whiteness. So quote unquote, white countries are considered to be good. Other countries are not so good, right? So even for a country like Ethiopia that was never colonized, these white supremacist ideas have really infiltrated how we think about destinations, how we kind of present, as, a migrant living in the US having plenty of opportunities, not thinking about, we're going to be Black immigrants in a highly racialized society versus, migrants in other parts of the world that are, having a lot of problems, right? Just to kind of put it blandly. So I think there's a lot of panic because of this racialized ideas of what is good and what is bad. And there has not been a lot of historical analysis in terms of historically how these populations have been incorporated in places that, quote unquote, like the Middle East, and how that has changed over time. And again, I think this is something that is changing at the moment, but there's still quite a lot of work that needs to be done in this area.
Thanks so much. I'm conscious of time. We only have a couple of minutes remaining. I wonder if either of you have some closing words or questions or comments for one another. I'm kind of struck by the period of exchange with the USSR and Cuba and China that was intentionally positioned as a sort of circular movement rather than a unidirectional movement. So that's one thing that's on my mind.
So let me just say one more thing about that. It was primarily like the USSR as the destination, right? But at the same time, there were quite a lot of folks from the Soviet Union or former Soviet Union and from Cuba that came to Ethiopia and stayed. So that's an interesting exchange. And again, unfortunately, there's not a lot of enough research on this area. But I do have a comment or question for Dr. Lina, if that's okay. When you were talking about the China-Africa relationship, one of the things that I was thinking about is in terms of soft power, right? And especially thinking about like Confucius centers that have been opened up in different parts of Africa, and kind of using this as a way to teach language, culture, but more than that, right? There's a lot of stuff that goes on around those centers. And it always makes me think about like the organizations that were opened by European colonizers, like La Francophonie and, like the Alliance Française and all those different others, like forgot the names for the British. There was the British Council, I think was one of them. There's quite a lot of these types of organizations. So I don't know if you've looked at this soft power from your kind of like relational approach between people. So I don't know if you want to like quickly comment on that, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the question. Yeah, so I did do some, I did visit the Confucius Institute in Addis Ababa University, and it was really eye-opening experience just to be just to go and visit and just speak to some of the staff at the time. This was 6 years ago, who were working in the Confucius Institute, and just the way that it was built, like the interest in it, what it does. And yet, like you're right on, because it's not just about teaching language and teaching culture. It's so much more than that. And what was striking to me about this was every time I was at the African Union headquarters doing interviews, I would get questions about, oh, do you know that there's a Confucius Institute in Addis? And I would say, yes, I know. And I would get the follow-up question would be, oh, do you know when do they teach Chinese for business? And if they do, what are the hours? And so there was a huge demand and a huge interest in what the Confucius Institute. But what was interesting to me was that it was known to people that there is a Confucius Institute and that it's open, and that the approach of the Confucius Institute is that it welcomes students who are students of Addis Ababa University, diplomats who are part of the African Union headquarters, business communities, people, the community at large. And it was really interesting, where I also got to visit both Goethe Institute and Alliance Française in Addis Ababa, and essentially the approaches are very different. Whereas Confucius Institute is located inside the university, Alliance Française is tucked away. I think it was a piazza. I think it's some villa that's kind of like really fenced, and it's a different vibe. And the same way with the Goethe Institute, it's way out, like past, it's kind of, I think, near maybe the US Embassy, if I'm not mistaken. I forgot a bit. It's been a while, but it's in the Arat Kilo area anyway. It's a sort of also villa set up and gates and fences, and it's a very different vibe in that way as well. It caters to a completely different audience. The Confucius Institute at Addis Ababa also doesn't only offer classes, but also, of course, gives kind of scholarships to students to go study in Chinese universities, but also connects Ethiopian students who speak Mandarin to Chinese enterprises and firms, and that are interested in employing Ethiopian youths. So so they do that work as well, sort of that matchmaking between students who are, so in a way, at the end of the day, it's sort of learning Chinese language becomes sort of a practical skill, because it's immediately connected to opportunities for further studying, in China, or opportunities for getting jobs, good paying jobs, maybe hopefully good paying jobs in Ethiopia. And so it's connected to something that is kind of practical, that you're gonna use it for job or use it for further study. And so I think I see Confucius Institutes as a lot more than soft power. I see them precisely as a relational network building institutions that build these networks between diplomats learning the language and students going to China, and Chinese companies coming into African countries and looking for labor or looking for training skills. And so they do all kinds of different things. It's not one dimension, it's multiple dimensions that I think taking a network approach helps us maybe understand it a little bit better and give it all the nuance that it deserves, instead of, one kind of equivalent to Alliance Française, equivalent to Goethe Institute, which I don't think it is. I think it's a different product.
Thank you both so much for your time and for sharing about your work. I'm just going to quickly share the screen with our audience to remind you of our next event in this series, which will focus on aesthetics and cultural studies of Indian Ocean worlds with Professor May Joseph, Mira Rai Watts, and myself. Thank you so much for your engaged participation today. And I'm very much looking forward to both Dr. Girma's first book and Dr. Benabdallah's second book. They both promise to be fascinating. So if we can give them a round of applause from wherever you are, we won't hear each other, but we'll know that we are in celebration together. Thank you.